strică-ne poza.
Eu nu pot să stric nicio
De la
poză.
frumoasa adunare.
Eu pot doar să o îmbunătățesc, Bogdan. Nu pot să stric.
Pa a mea e stricat.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you all for coming. I hope you're comfortable there. And thank you, London Home, for helping us organize this event. So today we brought Emptiness to Romania, and Emptiness, this is the name of our research project, which consists of 4 people here and some people in various other places. But we, Maria Gunko, Dr. Dacia Zinovska, Friederike Punk, and me, Volodymyr Artyuk, collaborate at this project on the basis of University of Oxford. And we, since I'm doing fieldwork here, and since the very beginning, our project has been inspired by the articles and books of many Romanian scholars, of whom we have invited. And we would also like to have a conversation with them. And please greet them. This is Georgia Rodriguescu from the University of Sheffield, Dr. Stefan Dorandel from Francis Greiner Institute of Anthropology of the Romanian Academy of Science. Dr. Călin Cotoi from the University of Bucharest, Dr. Liviu Chelcea from the University of Bucharest, and Razvan Dumitru, a sociologist and an anthropologist who leads a company called Social Insights. Welcome. So today we are gonna talk, we're gonna discuss several issues, several questions that we have put out in front of our guests. We will start with a brief and provocative introduction of our topic that would last around 25 minutes. I will later invite our guests to reflect on the issues that we have raised on our concepts and approaches on the basis of their own research, on the basis of their academic and practical experience. So we'll start now, and I would invite Dacia Zinovska to start with an introduction to today's evening. Okay?
Thank you. Actually, can you hear me without the microphone?
No.
No? No, okay. If I start screaming in the microphone, please wave or something. Thank you for organizing this, Volodya, and also London Home. I have to say that this whole Oxford thing is a bit of a Potemkin village, because if you start scratching the surface, you find a Russian, a Latvian, an East German, and a Ukrainian. So if you're expecting posh British accent, we're not gonna deliver, I'm afraid. And I think I speak for everyone if I say that we very much look forward to this conversation, and we're here to learn as much as we are to share. Is it okay if there's some kind of... No? It's all good? Okay. And I hope we can generate interesting points of convergence and divergence when we talk about what we refer to as emptiness in our respective field sites. And I'm also grateful that you've joined us on what I still understand is a vacation day in Romania, so thank you. So before there was something called the Emptiness Project, which now sounded just about as a rock band. You know, we brought Emptiness to Romania, and we tried to live up to this today while taking pictures around town. Emptiness and emptying were terms that I encountered in eastern part of Latvia and Latgale, and people used these terms to describe the changing relations between place and people. And I first encountered them around 2010 when I was researching emigration after the financial crisis. And I was researching immigration from the perspective of the places from which people were leaving. And so these places were losing not only people, but they were also losing jobs, schools, services, shops, social life, and according to the remaining residents, also the future. Emigration was not the cause, it was a symptom. It was a symptom of a process that had started much earlier with the automation of the railway in the area where I worked already in the 1970s, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, neoliberalism and nationalism of the 90s, joining the European Union in 2004, the austerity policies of 2009, the closure of the border with Russia in 2014. So lots of complicated trajectories created this process people talked about as emptying. I will not go into full ethnographic description of emptiness in this part of Latvia, but I wanted to bring this up just to say that there was ethnographic inspiration for using the term emptiness, and that's very important for us. It's crucial that the term comes from ethnography, and we've been using it to shape this quite complex problem space, and also to mobilize it analytically, and I'll talk about it in a second. It is not a precise and pure term. It is entangled with all kinds of modern and colonial imaginations of chaos before or after order, of nothingness before or after civilization. All are present in one way or another in my interlocutors' interpretations in their symbolic repertoire, shaped by also socialist modernity, of course. But it cannot, this term cannot be reduced to these tropes, because people do kind of add to it their concrete experiences and the meaning of today's emptiness. So I'm just saying that here in case, you know, we are tempted to think of this colonial emptiness as somehow being predominant. And most importantly, emptiness is also not easily juxtaposed to fullness. In fact, what it is juxtaposed to remains an ethnographic question, and that's something that we're looking into. And of course, it also shouldn't be taken literally, because in these places that people refer to as empty or emptying, there are houses, if abandoned or crumbling, there are people, if old and some dying, there are things, if fallen into disarray, there are overabundance of nature, of what people often talk about as nature taking over what used to be cultivated fields. So all these things are there, and that's what this constellation is often what my interlocutors describe as emptiness. So much for the ethnographic inspirations, but there are also analytical inspirations. And one of them was my dissatisfaction with the overwhelming focus on the ever-growing and super diverse global cities in critical scholarship on space and place, and the neglect of this kind of my kind of emptying places, or their appearance as dark, unknowable voids. For example, geographers Neil Brenner and Nikos Katsikis write about kind of trying to rethink the contemporary respatialization of capital and write about what they call global urban agglomerates and operational landscapes, which are other spaces that are not urban and that are subordinated to these global urban agglomerates in this kind of functional relationship that they provide services for these global cities. And then for them, there are also another type of space called hinterlands, in other words, those that are not even good for supplying the cities. And that's all fine, but they have nothing to say about these so-called dark voids. You know, what happens actually in these places that are respatialized in this way. So that's another inspiration. We've looked at at different theories of spatiality of capital, of uneven development, central periphery. Those all probably mean something to you, spatial fix, and so forth and so on. And we find them all a little bit wanting in terms of trying to explain what we're actually seeing. many of the places that we look at probably could be described as somewhat even expelled from global circuits of capital, to use Saskia Sassen's term. When taking a closer look at these places that we might describe as emptying, and we can see how some of them are incorporated into capitalist dynamics as sites of tourism, for example, often reinvented as places of residence for the global middle classes, and others yet are cleared of social life altogether and turned into forests or massive fields. And just the other day, BBC ran a story on Schmilke, Eastern Germany success story, a village bought by an investor and turned, or he's attempting to turn it into what might be called a Disneyland of sustainability. Stefan, of course, has also written about a village in Bulgaria that is hoping for a similar future, that is kind of investing into this sort of idea of, using springs and someone investing and turning into a thermal bath town. In my fieldwork locations, the remaining residents in the Latvia-Russia borderlands invent a variety of museums, from a museum of happiness to a bat exhibit, also assign significant historical and cultural significance to great rocks. I mean, all kinds of things to attract tourism, to sort of embrace tourism as this last utopia that might save a place from definitive emptying. And they're often aided by a variety of EU trained specialists who tell them, and we attended one of these events in our cross-field visit to Latvia, these development specialists who trying to educate the remaining rural residents into how to appeal to the global tourist class, how to categorize various tourists and cater to their needs. And on the very top was this, if I remember collecting some kind of lifestyle tourism, so you could turn your old bathhouse into a spa and, invite yoga loving and meditating. That was the kind of the top level tourism, that they were taught to aspire for. One settlement, for example, this utopia, this tourism utopia, is ever receding. One settlement, for example, that had a bike route run through it, and the bike route was made on the basis of where the former railway was, so the tracks were removed and the bike route was now put in. It sort of stopped at the Latvia-Russia border because the border closed recently, and there was nobody. Actually, I didn't see a single biker on that bike path all summer, except for some local kids and a few Swedish motorbikers who'd come to the border region and used Google Translate to ask local residents, whether they were afraid of Russia invading. So I guess there's kind of a tourism potential in being close to Russia these days as well. Sometimes, knowing that at least a few of you work on housing and restitution issues and property in Romania, I thought I'd use another example just to sort of talk about how we see emptiness. And I find that sometimes this repurposing of residential spaces that emerged around a productive hub during socialist period, or even before, say, a railway station or a factory, sometimes it's hindered my material legacies of production, such as crumbling factories, or in my case also buildings of unidentified possession, which are usually residential homes that sit on municipal land in various states of decay. And this usually means that the person who lived in that building during the Soviet period and may have had the right to privatize it did not do it, did not obtain legal title in the post-Soviet period, and for a variety of reasons, lack of money, lack of knowledge, just simply didn't think in terms of private property, or they may have thought that they built this house in the 50s and who is going to take it away from them, and they were correct, nobody did, but then also they actually didn't hold legal title to it. And I actually thought to bring this up as a kind of an example of non-property rather than fuzzy property. And I want, because of my understanding of fuzzy property being that there are overlapping claims to these buildings, and in this case actually there were no claims, so nobody could, these buildings were inscribed into the state's land register and cadastre and so forth and so on, but nobody could actually do anything with them. And I find that to be, if Volodya will talk about his typologies of emptiness later, I find these buildings actually to be what you call, I guess, a Polanyi type of emptiness, resisting a Marx type of emptiness. In other words, they're preventing actually commodification of that space because no capital can enter. They are just there, and that's it. Nobody can buy them because they don't belong to anyone. So anyway, that's just a kind of little snippet of related material. In addition to this capital-focused respatialization of emptiness, we're also interested in how shifting forms of political power affect the places in which we work. For example, sovereignty, statecraft, how those work in the current historical conjuncture. And in Latvia especially, but also elsewhere, I think it's not sufficient to talk about the workings of capital without talking about the workings of sovereignty and geopolitics. The deindustrialization was as much an outcome of political decision-making because the industrialization actually represented Soviet occupation and the incoming of workers from the former Soviet Union. So deindustrialization was a political goal. It wasn't just the effect of global integration or joining the European Union and so forth. And again, this bike path that I mentioned earlier stopped at the border. So it's very much important to look at these processes together. And finally, we're also, of course, interested in actually forms of life, how people live in such conditions, their practices, relations, hopes, fears, imaginations, meaning-making, and some try to reconnect to the world, some embrace tourism as this last utopia or something else, some go on living however they can, assemble livelihoods from a variety of sources, and many leave and many also die. I think this last summer, or rather somewhere since March, in one of my fieldwork locations, 5 people died. So every time I returned, I found out about a new person who died. And so I guess the question is, could all of this really be encompassed under the term emptiness? Yes and no, of course. Emptiness is kind of a window through which we're trying to access this really complex set of questions, but also it helps us to bracket already tried analytical frameworks and pause a little bit and think, are they, to what extent are they useful? Perhaps we should be building a new theory to think about this. It may be called something else in other places, darkness in Armenia, or if I'm pronouncing this right, gol in Romania, I think we talked about some of the terms used to refer to the empty buildings in Bucharest. Each term designating a particularly visible or particularly painful element of a constellation, of a local constellation of emptiness. And the it itself, what is it that we talk about when we talk about emptiness, might be changing along the way. And this is precisely our point in embarking upon a comparative project on emptiness, or when we return to emptiness. We think of comparison and the associated theorizing as a lateral process that creates a chain of family resemblances, in the process possibly changing the very object with which we started. Instead of definitively defining emptiness as an overarching framework, we start ethnographically, engage analytically, and then move to other ethnographic contexts and also theoretical tools. And this kind of comparison does not depend on stable variables that are present in every setting that we look at as a potential setting of emptiness. If something is missing or there's something extra, it doesn't invalidate it, it simply adds another layer to what we're looking at. But this is all still with an eye to generating kind of critical mass of scholarship concerned with something like emptiness that could push our thinking further about the spatial and social articulations of contemporary capitalism, state, politics, and the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dacia. Indeed, we have been inspired first by Dacia's theoretical proposals and by her field site in East Latvia, and this was in effect both a theoretical and empirical intuition and resonance that pushed us to move on and develop this concept and related concepts further. We'll spend a couple of minutes before inviting our guests to respond to briefly tell about our case, our sites, and by highlighting certain problems that appear in them. I would invite Fredrika.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll try to keep it. I'll try to keep it brief, but also give you an ample introduction into my field site. So I'm doing my research in Eastern Germany, and you could say that the discursive equivalent to emptiness in Latvia is left behindness in Eastern Germany. And left behind places are generally those that were very hit hard by the wave of industrial closures and layoffs in the 1990s after Germany was reunified. Places that subsequently, over the course of the 90s until the present day, lost about half or even more of their population as people emigrated westward or later then to towns in Eastern Germany or cities that were doing better, that were recovering from the shock, and places that since the 1990s have only been disintegrating further as ever more shops, restaurants, bakeries and schools closed. Railway stops were cancelled, that's a very prevalent phenomenon, as public transport was organized in more efficient ways and as municipal budgets became ever more indebted. So after the initial excitement about German reunification, the end of socialism after 1989 died down, these post-industrial towns and villages entered a so-called paradigm of shrinkage. That's something that anthropologist Felix Ringel has written about, and this paradigm of shrinkage meant that to some degree policymakers and residents were accepting the condition of shrinkage. They were learning to live with and govern shrinkage and the prospect of further decline rather than hoping for a new future to emerge. And this manifested in policies like managed shrinking, so tearing down buildings, especially socialist prefabs, to match the declining number of residents, and yeah, basically living lives without much ambition in a condition of presentism. And this is where my research now comes in. In 2019, the federal government of Germany introduced a game changer that completely flipped the paradigm around from a paradigm of shrinkage into a paradigm of future making. And this is because in 2019, Germany decided to embark on an energy transition from coal to renewable energies, which is not only an industrial switch, but a huge scale development program where the federal government provides 40 billion euros to the affected areas to develop into so-called fit for the future regions that are reindustrialized or in other ways made fit for the future. And as you can imagine, as 3 of the 4 coal mining districts of Germany are located in Eastern Germany, that generated this moment of, wow, now we have a chance to revitalize that we cannot miss. And now we have a chance to overcome this post-socialist left behindness, this paradigm of shrinkage. And what is important to know in this context is that the future-making process is outsourced to the municipal level. So while the federal government provides the money, it is municipalities that have to come up with ideas and submit grant applications and then hope to be selected to participate in the sweep of progress. And on the local level, this creates this feeling of a tipping point. Either we now make it and become a place that's fit for the future, or we're sort of doomed to continue in the downward spiral of emptying from now on. And my sub-project within the Emptiness project kind of looks at what I hypothesize as the reproduction of left behindness. So the phenomenon that we see emerging is that the already emptying municipalities don't have the personnel, the creativity, the skills to hit the right tone for these grant applications. While around them, the cities that are already doing well get one grant after the other. And I'm looking at this phenomenon in a small coal mining town near the Polish border and follow the attempts and failures of coming up with future projects, like a mountain bike park, a bike lane, an exhibition space, a museum and old industrial buildings, etc., as they are attempted and then ultimately fail. And the questions that I am concerned with and that I wanted to bring to this panel are the following three. So how does the experience of post-socialist emptying shape the disposition of a place in the struggle to partake in a new sweep of progress? How is the switch from planning for shrinkage to planning for development carried out at the municipal or local level? So what things and ideas are mobilized as worthy of future making? Who are the agents of future making? And how does this competitive logic of future making in the so-called grantocracy, that's a term I recently learned, reproduce spatial dynamics of concentration and disconnection in terms of capital and people?
Thank you, Friederike. And I would invite Maria.
Thank you. I'll start with a joke which encompasses all three parts of my research: the state, infrastructures, and deterioration. So two inmates in a Soviet camp are discussing their life, and one of them asks, "So what sentence are you serving under? Political, is it a political or is it a criminal code?" So the second one, yes, it's of course political. I was a plumber, and so I was called in the local party headquarters to look at the sewerage system, and it was all collapsed and rotten. So I said, I cannot do anything, the whole system has to be changed. This is how I got my 7 years. So when discussing emptiness in post-socialist or post-Soviet realm where I work, often the talk descends into discussing the state. So emptiness is being produced by the state which is withdrawing. But the state is being, it's not endemic to the post-Soviet realm or post-socialist realm, right? The welfare state, the Keynesian welfare state is also withdrawing, and there's this change there's also privatization, there's also marketization, and so on. So what is specific about this region, right? The post-Soviet emptiness in relation to the state. So there's these two things. First of all, is that it's not marketization, but sometimes it's just the state cannot perform these functions anymore. It cannot sustain infrastructures, it cannot provide welfare because it doesn't have the resources. And the second thing is this non-property issues, which Dutton mentioned, is privatization in the post-Soviet states. It was very hectic, and there's this numerous property which belongs to no one, and nobody knows how to maintain it and who has to do it. So in my research, I'm looking at the state and how it withdraws, but actually it doesn't withdraw. It changes its nature. So there's statecraft, which is how the state takes care of the territory, takes care of the people, provides infrastructures, and then there's statehood, which is intertwined with identity, sovereignty, power, ideologies. So the statehood may be there, it may be very strong, but the statecraft part is actually withdrawing. So my field site is in Armenia, and in the beginning of before the Soviet rule, it was under Imperial Russian rule, so it's actually really intertwined with Russian history. So before the Soviet state came, no other country which was a part of the Russian Empire was in such a dire situation, because it was First World War, but also genocide. So Armenians, they were scattered around, they were these refugees that had no home, had no food, had no means to sustain themselves. And this is precisely the same thing that happened to Armenia in the beginning of 1990s. No other Soviet republic was in such a dire situation. In 1988, there was a massive earthquake in Spitak, which actually destroyed the whole northern part of Armenia, a lot of towns were in disrepair, and about 120,000 people died. And was the first time after the Second World War when the Soviet Union actually asked for international help to kind of provide this territory with means, with food, with clothing to help rebuild Armenia. But then the Soviet state collapsed and all the rebuilding stopped. So there's this numerous infrastructures that are in state of disrepair precisely because they were destroyed by the earthquake. But moreover, there was this long-standing conflict with the neighboring country, with Azerbaijan, over this enclave, Nagorno-Karabakh, which was predominantly populated by Armenians. 70% of the population were Armenians, but the Soviet state attributed it to Azerbaijan. And so when the Soviet Union collapsed, a whole wave of violence was unleashed in that region. And so Armenia got blocked from the side of Turkey, from the side of Azerbaijan, and then so no gas was being transported to Armenia. The nuclear power plant was stopped because of the earthquake in the previous years. And there was a war in Georgia, between Georgia, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia, so the gas could not be transported to Armenia from the Russian side. So the country literally for 3 years descended into darkness, and when I talk darkness, I actually mean darkness there was electricity only 1 hour per day. And so these years are called literally the dark years, or the cold years, or the hungry years, but predominantly dark years. And so the emptiness in Armenia that is there now, or rather how they call it kvats, or abandonment, is this remnants, which come from the dark years, because only 7 factories could work during the dark years, so most of them did not recover. And then there's this broken infrastructures also from the earthquake, and the ones that were not repaired after the dark years. And the conflict with Karabakh is still ongoing, and it's like constitutive to making of Armenian state. So much money is going into war, to statehood, and there's no money left for statecraft. So there's numerous abandoned infrastructures all around Armenia. And so my research questions pertain to which infrastructures are being maintained by the people, or by the state, or by capital. So which infrastructures are important to be maintained, who maintains them, and how do they get legitimacy and authority to kind of deal with this. And at the end, I'm ultimately looking at how the state is being remade through how the weapons of the weak and capital, they become this constitutive components to the contemporary state. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. And before summarizing our questions and addressing our guests, I would briefly tell what I'm personally interested in as the crucial question in my part of the project. That's the conditions that generate emptiness and the possibility of exercising certain agency within these conditions. We operationalized emptiness in one instance as a degradation or dissipation of the previously existing spatial and societal order. So it's a relational thing. It's of course you experience emptiness as a societal condition when you used to experience something else, something that for you were fuller life, some sort of flourishing that you lost, or that you're in a state where there is no flourishing and you expect. The places that we study are the places where both these coordinates existed or would exist, but they're withering away. My own field experience was uneven and variegated. I started studying Ukrainian immigrants and internally displaced people before this war started, or this stage of the war started. And back then, in the relative stability of ceasefire in Donbass. What fascinated me was the interplay between emptiness as unintended consequence of certain processes and emptiness as a certain condition that is functional for the state, for example, or for certain political parties. Some scholars like Alexander Forbrook called this slow emptiness and slow violence as something that is structurally caused but is not even experienced as violence. It's there is nobody to blame. There is no white palace to storm. And overt, explicit violence, which is the violence of war, the violence of destruction that we've seen recently as on a large scale, on a huge scale. So this led me to develop a certain theory that would link these generative processes to broader historical trends in capitalist modernity that would question the theories that we've been using before, and we've been relying on such authors as Henri Lefebvre and David Harvey and other names that were mostly focused on urbanization processes. What my experience of fieldwork in Ukraine showed was that the condition that has not been grasped, for example, by Lefebvre, although a lot of aspects have been grasped, but historically he was working in a situation of a galloping capitalist accumulation, and capitalist accumulation that was coordinated by the state, by a fairly strong state, a welfarist state too. But in post-Soviet Ukraine and post-Soviet space in general in the 90s and the early 2000s, we saw something else spreading. We saw spaces of stagnation, spaces of withdrawal of capitalism, spaces that, following Marx's term on that would deal with the reserve army of labor, we would call surplus spaces, or surplus lives and surplus spaces, where what was happening was dispossession without accumulation. So this would be dying in small villages in central Ukraine, one of the richest areas in Ukraine, in fact, where there was a chronic mismatch between capital, land, and labor and people, which led to uneven development and so on. And obviously, well, that's actually something that I call the Polanyi type of emptiness. Emptiness under the condition of this embedded market, this where state is withdrawing, but this is also a condition where the capital is withdrawing. What would be the agency in this kind of environment when all relations are dissipating? One answer is violence, pure violence, war. Everything is destroyed. Why not blow up the whole thing? And probably this is something that leads a lot of recruits now to become soldiers. The other thing would be some small activism, NGO-driven activism, one-cause movements that they also saw spontaneously emerge in Ukraine and among refugees whom I've been studying. What could it change is this? Are these movements that are able to reach fullness? I haven't found the answer now, and that's something I'm going to focus on. So these are essentially, we have raised essentially the questions that we've been grappling for over a year now, and I would like to repeat that both our preliminaries and these questions have been very much inspired by the long tradition of writing on Romanian countryside, on Romanian industrial development, And now, keeping this in mind, we would very much want to hear from Romanian scholars based on their experience, what they heard from what they heard in our cases, what they think about our questions. Thank you. I don't think you should like go one by one or focus on one question per each. You can choose any question you like, or you can respond to any of the things that we've said. Probably the order would be like this. We would start from Georgia, if you don't mind. I think this will be fully year round. Each of you will have 10-15 minutes, and once we finish, we'll exchange the second set of questions. Thank you. I think you can use this microphone.
Thanks a lot. This is working. I think now it's working. Thanks a lot, Dace. Thanks a lot, Volodya, for inviting me, and I'm very happy to hear about your research, Mash and Federica. I'm George. I'm based at the University of Sheffield, and I consider myself a political ecologist. I do research on wildlife trafficking, private protected areas, and wilderness production. I've been very much paying attention to how your project developed for a couple of years now, because the framework that your project is offering is very relevant for my research. That is looking at how land abandonment in the European Union is mobilized as a spatial fix for the green growth strategies of the European Union. Of course, Europe has been very industrious in pointing to the global south about how to go about biodiversity conservation. Overpopulation was one of the causes, overconsumption and so on, but the irony is that at home we face the increasing problem of land abandonment. We have large swaths of land that are purely left because agriculture is no longer a valid livelihood, because the infrastructure is lacking, because the state is not as important, because capital left, and so on, maybe because the soil is not fertile anymore, or all sorts of like mix of factors. And this is posing huge problems for biodiversity conservation, for the way we address wildfires, mostly the Mediterranean basin, for the way we try to produce food in the European Union, and so on. So it's one of the biggest challenges now. Of course, it's intimately enmeshed with climate change and so on. So I think it's very, very important to offer a political ecology lens to emptiness. And one of the ways to do this is by looking at land abandonment. Of course, personally, I don't like this term because it involves an intentionality. People abandon this land, which is a voluntary act. But for lack of a better term, I think we will have to stay with land abandonment to refer to a very complex plethora of processes. And of course, currently, this is one of the opportunities that is promoted because these huge tracts of land offer fertile ground for experimentation, for rewilding, for ecosystem restoration, for wilderness protection, for expansion of private protected areas, and of strict protection of nature. Let's not forget that the recent European Biodiversity Strategy mentions that the green growth that is promoted by the European Green Deal will be intimately connected with securing at least 10% of the European land and sea for strict protection, which means no human intervention, and 30% of seas and land for private protected areas, expansion, and full protection of old-growth forest, virgin forest, these natural primary or primeval forests that are considered untouched, unmanaged, in which humans have never set foot. If I quote the legal documents, they function as spatial fixes, and I like to call them green internal peripheries, because their existence favors this kind of unequal ecological exchange. Without the EU, we need to protect these lands in order to continue with our green growth strategies. You know, it's no longer an acceptable way of doing economic growth, promoting economic growth by importing deforestation, for example, from the Amazon or from the Southeast Asia and so on. We need now to protect what is left of our untouched nature on the continent. But of course, we forget that these abandoned lands pose very, very important questions about ownership, about use, about the political tools that the local population have in order to voice their rights and their culture and their concerns and so on. And I would refer to two particular cases that emerged from my work in the last couple of years. One is about human-wildlife conflict, and I've been doing research in the Southern Carpathians and in Harghita, which is the Eastern Carpathians in Romania. And currently what we see here is that lots of sheepfolds and alpine pastures are just left grazed. They used to be grazing lands because the farming strategies changed from subsistence farming, where everyone had 1 or 2 cows, couple of sheep and so on, to big farms, which rely mostly on fats such as corn and not necessarily grazing. This sees mushrooming of land conversion in these areas, where you had agricultural production, now you have production of corn to feed these big farms. You no longer have these transhumans that was going to alpine pastures, but everyone, all these cattle stay in the village in these big farms. And what is happening is that some of these grazing lands, alpine meadows, are engulfed by forests, some become shrubland, some become a very important habitat for large carnivores, such as brown bears and so on. But because we have this change of crops, bears used to come now closer to the village and feed on corn in areas where there was no corn 10 years ago. Of course, EU subsidies are very important for this land conversion because it favors big farms and so on. And this is very important to notice that land abandonment can produce human-wildlife conflicts in some of these areas through land conversion. It's a space of extinction because this huge biodiversity in the alpine pastures doesn't exist anymore, or it's threatened. It's a space of experimentation because several rewilding projects seize the opportunity of this passive management of alpine pastures to see what will happen there if we just leave these lands to leave nature take its course. And it's also a space of knowledge production, because you have a swath of scientists coming to study these conversions, ecologically, socially, political, and so on, that will inform further policy making in the centers of this unequal ecological exchange kind of process. And the second thing that I would like to mention from my research to answer to some of your questions, who is doing this and who benefits from it, and what's put in place of this emptiness, I would like to refer to a private protected area that is taking shape in the Southern Carpathian Mountains. It's a wilderness reserve, a world-class wilderness reserve, also called as the European Yellowstone, and so on. You have all these superlatives. And of course, during post-socialist period, there were lots of conflicts over land, a lot of environmental crime, deforestation, and so on. So these lands became very cheap, and cheap nature is one of the processes of this capital accumulation in this area that is favored by land abandonment and emptiness. So because this cheap nature existed there, it proved to be a huge opportunity to develop private conservations. So they bought the land, they acquired hunting rights, management rights, custodianship rights, even commoners' rights in the local commons and so on. So they regulate access. People were no longer able to graze, so the alpine pasture became once again abandonment, but it was like an active process of doing so. And now, because the biodiversity is declining there, you have a space for rewilding, to bring bisons, to bring beavers, to bring all this charismatic fauna, to wiggle the rivers, to open mosaic landscapes in the forests, and so on. So what is coming after emptiness sometimes is this spatial fix to foster our green development fantasies. And I will stop here because I'm sure the others will have lots of other interesting points, and I'm sorry if I have not replied punctually to your questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you. Please, you may not wait for me. You may continue like in a dialogue if you want. That would be completely fine.
First of all, thank you for having me here. I'll just start with a question which maybe is presumptuous, but is there any emptiness at all? I mean, it really depends on the positionality of the ethnographer. Myself, I'm what is usually called today a multi-species ethnography practitioner, more or less. So, which means, simply put it, that I don't discriminate between humans and non-humans, right? And I'm pretty sure some of you, maybe most of you, are familiar with multi-species literature. Anyhow, from this perspective, there is never an empty place. Like we within a project, we carry field work in several parts in Romania and Bulgaria, and we should have gone to Ukraine, but not for now. So in Tutrakan, it's a small town, 4,000, 5,000 people. Used to be like 10,000 people, maybe more, during socialism. A lot of houses are empty, especially those houses. But this is a town on the bank of the Danube. Now, these houses, of course, when you go there, obviously they are in a state of ruination. A lot of vegetation, this kind of big, almost like in Jurassic Park plants, huge. But these are not empty places. Jackals, a lot of jackals, and you can hear them every single night. Snakes, many other animals which actually thrive there. So, what an ethnographer would call an empty place, right? All people dead, or they work somewhere in Western Europe, and they don't really care about their houses anymore. It's actually not empty at all. If you look from a multi-species perspective, not only new plants thriving there, for instance, invasive species, invasive plants thriving there, but also a lot of animals. So my first observation would be maybe we should look closer to this emptiness concept or notion. And if you, of course, I don't ask you now to switch your theoretical perspective, but I just want you to make you aware that there is such a perspective in which, if you don't discriminate between humans and non-humans, you may actually find that there is actually no empty space at all. Maybe they are not humans anymore, but definitely other species took over the place and they thrive there, and they mingle with the humans all the time. So that would be my first observation. And also, I don't think, I mean, maybe once or twice there was the word ruin or ruination. Of course, emptiness probably also contained this idea of ruin and ruination, which is a concept in itself in anthropology. And I think, in somehow to quote, that there is an art of living on a ruined planet. It's the title of a famous book. So these ruins change the life of people living there, and they learn this art, which, when you come from the outside, it's difficult to almost to understand that. So that's it for now. Probably I'll come back with more.
Okay. Thank you for having me here, and congratulations on what looks like a really amazing project. And really looking forward to read what you're trying to publish. I was thinking about emptiness and how to connect it with my research, because actually I've been quite afraid of using emptiness until now, but I've been drawing circles around it, I think, in a way, around the concept, the experience, the trope of emptiness, and I've been using like vagueness or wastelands or Turenwag or interstitial lands or this kind of ruins, as Stefan said. But in a way, they do connect, I think, very intimately to emptiness. And obviously, emptiness can come in various ways, and it's a huge concept. And I'm sure you've thought about it, so I'm not going to go too much into that. I'm just going to try to show you how it was useful for me in my research. And my research on emptiness, well, not really on emptiness, but connected to emptiness, started when I realized by going through a lot of nature protected areas, new nature protected areas in Romania, that they are full of ruins, actually. That nature comes together with ruins, especially post-socialist ruins in our case, but not only post-socialist ruins. For example, in Hunedoara County, there are ancient ruins from ancient times, ruins from Norwegian found times, all waiting to be ruined or being already ruined. In Dobruja, there are ruins from Ottoman times, also ruins from the various waves of showcase modernization processes, and also ruins from present-day nature times. And what I found in Bucharest, and I think this is a different kind of emptiness of ruination, is middle-class ruins. Actually, in a way, the way the middle class invents nature in order to obliterate the ruins of post-socialism, or invents wilderness, or connect with some kind of wilderness in order to make former socialist ruins invisible. So, obviously, there are problems with ruins, and I'm not going to go there. It's an overdose of Benjamin and a little bit of romanticism. What I realized that the first kind of nature emptiness I dealt with, or I stumbled on actually, is nature that really emerged as a part of a post-socialist promise of redevelopment, of remodernization, of transforming the destroyed, blasted landscapes that were formerly agricultural, industrial, or mining areas into new tourist facilities and new tourist areas, which is actually, I mean, it's a very complicated process, but it's nature comes with this meaning. And because of that, it's interesting how this new nature, as some people call it, in the countryside, also creates some kind of new moral landscapes. People who are entitled to this nature, people who are less entitled to this new nature and this new promise of modernity. Obviously, people who decide to leave, or who have already left a long time ago, to Italy and Spain, mostly for the Romanian case. But also the emergence of some kind of critical discourse based on this new nature that tries to make sense of the new power inequalities, of the new distribution of power, which is still present in this area. So I would say that this kind of nature emptiness, of this post-socialist emptiness, also, obviously it's disempowering, very structural, but it also can create some kind of critical empowering discourses. And it's always interesting to see ethnographically and historically how this happens, if it happens. Then in the Bucharest case I've been working on lately, I stumbled again on what seems to be a very productive emptiness. That started as a pit, as a kind of a hole in the ground. It was also called Groapa Bucharest. Then became horticultural land, monastery, socialist empty reservoir, and then nature park. And the emptiness attracted people and projects of transformation. The promises of filling the emptiness actually pushed away people, and people who were already living there. And when this failed, eventually other peoples were attracted, projects, natures, animals, and also historicities, way of imagining temporality and hope. And the problem that I encountered there, more than the other emptiness, the other nature emptiness, has been one of vagueness in a way, of how to really perceive this, and also one of aesthetics. What is foregrounded and what is backgrounded in this kind of emptiness? In a way, this new emptiness emerges a back and forth process. What is nature, what is not nature, what is empty, what is full, who is part of this process. And another important thing, I believe, that I realized at the end of my research, and maybe hopefully it's going to be part of a new research, is that empty places can network. That there is this kind of, well, in various ways. For example, this Bucharest Park is networked through middle class networks as a urban nature that is similar to urban nature in other idealized places like London, like Vienna, like other European big cities. And in this way, our middle class is also like a European middle class, by having this European nature, which erases socialism. So it's a complicated temporal politics going on there. But also, I think that these empty spaces, these empty urban spaces, these wastelands, can also be made to network in more underground, maybe, but more liberating ways. I don't know, starting from wildfires in the cities. There are places where wildfires are still going on. It's a bad thing, maybe. But also it's kind of a liberating thing in a way. And I'm still striving with this idea of how to network emptiness and empty places in this parts of the world. So I'll stop here and
Hello. So it's really nice to meet the people behind the project and the text. It's wonderful. I read the stuff written by each of you. And Colleen said that empty places can network, and I think we are a living example right here. Like others, I have encountered empty spaces in my research sites at different points. And what I want to do is just like think through these research sites and raise some question points, discussion points, reactions about what you guys wrote on emptiness. So my first kind of reaction is like, it seems to me like you really nicely describe the pull factors in the naturalized creation of emptiness, like people, money, state attention, state care, being pulled out of certain territories, sucked out of those territories, and thus having emptiness. And I guess that there is something interesting to learn from situations of people actively being pushed away from those places, like Colleen mentioned in the creation of that park in Bucharest, or attempted creation, people were actually chased away. So maybe this, the little I know of migration studies, was like pull and push factors. Maybe it would be interesting to think through, just to explain a bit, two projects that I worked on, one on housing restitution and another one on the transformations of industrial sites in Bucharest. Like with restituted houses, tenants are really literally pushed out by the riot police because families, young members of those property families, lawyers, oftentimes lawyers representing like ruthless real estate interests, try to kind of sever tenants from these houses so that they, can monetize them, and then you get temporary emptiness for sometimes decades, because those houses are left idle. Sometimes they are demolished. Sometimes real estate agents wait for them to collapse because they are landmarked and they cannot demolish them as such. So there is this kind of like strategic emptiness happening. The same with like industry, like about 20% of Bucharest's surface was industrial in the early 1990s, and again you get like real estate people checking up, like there is this guy from like some military 1870s military industrial plant. Actually it was used for like baking bread, and it was close to the railway station, and he was telling me like every other 2 weeks there is like this Collier International guy coming to check, have you decided to sell? No, thank you, but I'll come back in 2 weeks. So I wonder like if one shifts attention from the pull to the push factor and the push actors, like some additional questions might be perhaps interesting to think, like who are the actors that produce emptiness? How do such actors sever the ties between people and houses, in the case that I know? What kind of labor, routines and power does one need to achieve so that they create empty urban land for future kind of usage? How are those emptiness producing forces resisted and mitigated by families and different actors resisting emptiness? So that would mean shifting the ethnographic gaze from how how people experience emptiness and how they conceptualize it and what they perceive as emptiness, to how emptiness is produced by different futures, capital actors and state actors. And these are the most, Stefan and Kalin and George mentioned non-human actors. These are the most intimate forms of emptiness to me. I don't have COVID, but my voice is as such because of ragweed. Because these empty sites in Bucharest, because they sit idle, they get ragweed, and like a lot of people have allergies because of that, and it got really personal for me. So yeah. Also, I guess a kind of like second thought about this. Of course, you probably thought of all these things, but like these urban examples that I came across suggest to me that emptiness does not equal remoteness. So you can have like core processes happening in core urban areas rather than, I don't know, somewhere like in the mountains or something like that. The second point is like somehow related to the first, also to emphasize the power and the labor needed to empty places. Some places need to be empty in order to serve the ecological needs of other regions and cities. So it's not just like, like with Neil Brenner, like things move to cities, global cities, Saskia Sassen, and then you get like empty territories. You actually have those places actively requiring empty places. So I thought, like one project that I'm working on is like the tap water provision in New York City, and since the 1840s, the city has been in constant tension, political tension with its surroundings, going further and further, like up to 200 kilometers away, in order to land grab and like to grab hydrological resources. And they acquire the land and they force people out. It's been a bitter process of like urbanization of nature and water resources. It has happened in Boston as well and elsewhere. So you actually get like this kind of strategic emptiness. The city pays those people to not do certain things in the watershed, or like to leave, or not stop constructing new things. So one can also think, I guess, of demilitarized zones in I don't know, East and West Germany, or like North and South Korea, as an analogy of strategic emptiness. The next point is perhaps a little bit more fuzzy. So it's about post-socialism. And I think that's at some point you said that emptiness is not seeing the elements that you want to see. And for good reasons, but also for like shady reasons, the entire post-socialist historical cycle has been a landscape of political emptiness, of collapse of humanist ideals, right? Like socialism did not fulfill many things, but had these ideals, right? Let's make the society a better place, and their replacement with liberalism. And if one believes in liberalism and it's suited by it, fine. If not, post-socialism means undoing without replacement, loss of future. And my kind of reaction to that is, you know, like, okay, there is the absence of socialist ideals and all that, but on the other hand, you have a very steady presence of socialism as caricature, as a boogeyman, as like anti-communist propaganda and public education in East Germany and many other countries. And you kind of have it as an absent presence. So I was thinking, maybe if you thought, that's more like a question, if you thought of kind of, if you considered some non-binary analytics that move beyond or like are between empty and occupied. So like present absence, or like camouflaged absence, or like crafted absence, or like Potemkin presence, we mentioned that in the beginning, as if kind of presence. So this kind of like not empty, not fully occupied, but like hybrids of something empty and something else. The fourth point, it's about, you mentioned that's in your American Analogist article, like how post-socialist emptiness is different, and you say like in places like Africa, people are actually kind of helped to remain in certain parts so as not to move to Europe, and like the same, we can think of like Alaska during Cold War, people, the federal government subsidizing the logging industry so that it doesn't, people don't leave, or like Central America is the same. And that's, I think, very nice observation. On the other hand, I'm still trying to figure out why that I wanted to be post-socialist, so I like post-socialism. I just like, I'm trying to understand, like, if that hasn't happened elsewhere, like, so that was more like a question. And my fifth point, and I'll stop, is what kind of, it's a question that I've been thinking through another field site. What kind of political public does emptiness create? So, like for instance, the presence of bears in empty spaces creates this like ecological public, or like the hunters associations public, which may be local or maybe elsewhere. In one research site in New York where I worked, there is this creek river between Brooklyn and Queens, which is super polluted. There are people who are trying to clean it up, but the thing is, like, it's surrounded by abandoned warehouses, so there are no people there and no public to engage, to speak on behalf of somebody. So how do you create a political public out of something? In this case that I looked at, they seek to attract people by, for instance, offering free canoe, or like school programs to bring high school students to, identify plants and do plant recognition, or like try to engage the warehouse owners into some green projects. They mostly fails. So it seems like there is an interscalar aspect of emptiness. One creates publics elsewhere, and online or wherever. But just because something is empty doesn't mean that it doesn't have, you know, networks of association and power elsewhere, and I think that would also be fascinating. So yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you.
Lock the door, because I think we'll be here until the morning, and you're not leaving until April.
No, stay. You're all welcome.
No, meaning like, you know, to prevent people from leaving.
Yeah, in this sense, of course, we should do. Okay, Rosan.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me. I will go out a little bit of, well, all of you actually were talking about places outside of Romania as well. So I will speak a little bit about Moldova, Republic of Moldova, where I did my fieldwork in many years ago, 2008, 2007, 2010, something like that. And I'll try to make some associations. Probably I will be very erratic, and in that case, please stop me or redirect me, or just stop me if I speak too much. Or I think I will be actually shorter. I will be shorter than you guys. So I did this fieldwork in Moldova, looking at the state and the business in this particular period when Romania was just joined the European Union, and Moldova, Republic of Moldovan citizens at that point they were required to have visas for Romania. Before they didn't need to travel with visas to Romania. Why I'm saying that is because many Moldovans told me that they live in a pit, not in an empty place, but in a hole. So in a pit between two worlds. That was the negative description. Sorry? Într-o gaură. And in that sense, that was the negative description of their country. That was more popular around that period. And what people associated with this, it was kind of a dangerous thing to be in, because you didn't have solutions. That was the empty. If we can say emptiness can be characterized subjectively by this thing, I'm a little bit going against the positive kind of perspective of emptiness. I think from what I saw in Moldova, people were like living it really bad, and they were afraid of it, and they wanted to escape from it, basically. But I agree with this thing. I mean, yeah, nature is coming back after with the emptiness, of course. What I want to say is that what I noticed is how this hole or pit is created, or this emptiness was created. I'm trying to figure it out also theoretically from a political economic perspective. So I'm thinking that what is emptiness is actually a space between what Ivan Senin calls neo-patrimonialist in this part of the world, which is actually a rearrangement of property and of value. Once the state has not abandoned, but it abandoned its centralized model. So what actually the state did, it was like, okay, we are not organizing society anymore. We are rather privatizing society or leaving democracy to emerge and let people arrange their lives, yes? So what Moldovans would feel in that thing is that, okay, what is the two kind of solutions to this? You have market which gives value to things and gives you, I don't know, some opportunities in life. And you have new bosses, the oligarchs, that create also a structure in space, life, things like that. So you have this neo-patrimonial regime that actually doesn't want to work on a market mechanism, because what they want is monopolies. They just want to break all the resources and have their own monopolies, rather institutions, markets, services. Moldova is not a big economy. They just wanted to split up access to trade and some services that give to, I mean, transport and things that they can extract money from population, rent, in a kind of making the monopolies. So, and what is left, I mean, what was left? So you have this area of life that was like taken over by these oligarchs, arranging things nice, I mean, working. Other things were less, because how I got to this was making a comparison between Romania and Moldova. Moldova got more, I mean, at that period of time, Romania was flooded with foreign capital, and it was like I'm going on this kind of market economy model. Moldova was still on this neo-patrimonial model. So you can see the differences when you make the comparison. And you see that in Moldova, people, what was the solution in life? What they have, just get into this kind of patrimonial regime, get a job or getting under some kind of protection, start a business, but you need a political kind of krisha to have your business not only running, that was your job, but most of it protected against other people who had access or had the means of violence and things like that. Or you just emigrate. And what was left was this kind of empty place where you wanted to escape or get to a fuller place or whatever, a place with some sense. But going back to how I started, that's what I'm saying, I went erratic. But it was all not only, I mean, if you look at it, it's not only about political economy, about resources. It's more, for example, in Moldova, it was also about identity. It's also because the state kind of gave up, the Soviet state collapsed. So the state, the new Moldovan state gave up on defining a political identity or national identity for its citizens. It allowed this kind of smaller statelets within Moldova to emerge, and people thought, like, well, we were Soviets, but now we don't know. Compared with Romanians, we don't know who we are. We don't have this kind of over-encompassing identity. And some of them thought they were Moldovans, but this was always contested. And this also created this kind of lack or empty identity. And I did not start with an ethnographic example, but I will probably end with an ethnographic example, not against the anthropological format. We had in Romania. We had in 2015. We had a big fire in a club, and many people died. It was the collective fire. And in Romania declared, I think it was like some national day for mourning. And people in Moldova also No, how it was that the Romanian embassy opened a book to go there and sign again for the victims of the fire. And the Moldovan president at that time also, there was this kind of pro-Romanian president, because it was 2015. It was an older guy, and the Ukrainian war started, so the parliament kind of elected a more kind of pro-Western and also pro-Romanian president as a way to defend against possible danger from Russia. So this guy goes to the Romanian embassy and he signs also for the victims. And the media asks him why we didn't declare national mourning days also, as Romanians did. You see, many people care about it. And the guy says, well, I don't know, we don't have, I don't know what we don't have. And I thought that it's like perfect. It was the state, the head of the state, and it's in a way kind of saying that emptiness creates emptiness in itself. It's like reproducing, and you don't know, actually it's this lack of sense, you don't know what to grab or what you have. Yeah. And the second thing, I just wanted to say, out of this anthropological discussion, or maybe not, but I think it's very much connected with what you're doing. The Council of Europe in 2018 had a big project. Council of Europe consists of 47 countries, including Russia and many, it's not European Council, it's Council of Europe, is bigger than European Council. So they made this study about shrinking zones. They had this kind of, I don't know if you know about it, but they thought about how to map, first of all the shrinking zones in all these 47 countries. What is shrinking zone, how they define it, it was mostly in kind of population. So zones that are kind of losing population. And the idea was to transform or see how we transform shrinking zones in functional zones. That was the kind of policy behind it. And to imagine how, and they actually, what was the study also just observing, it was that each kind of shrinking zone, each kind of functional zone, if it has like a concentration of population which actually lives on depopulating other areas around it, or is connected with other areas that it's kind of feeding itself on. Yeah. So, but if you are interested in the study, I can, send the link or something.
Great. Thanks a lot, everyone. Extremely fascinating and stimulating responses. It's always thrilling to listen to how the concept with which you work resonates with others in their research. In fact, we've already transited to the third kind of round when we ask questions, and I've heard many stimulating questions. I think I'll give us the opportunity to respond to some of them. We've heard at least two very good conceptual questions of whether emptiness is at all relevant if we use a multi-species approach and if we don't only focus narrowly on the interests of these people. And,
just Homo
Homo sapiens. And the other question is it binary emptiness and something else, fullness or whatever, or is it a continuum or some sort of a constellation of concepts within which we are trying to situate ourselves? Yeah, I think these are the questions we will of course ask ourselves. I think I would ask Datsa to give her.
Thank you. This was amazing. Really amazing set of questions. I will try to combine some of them into something coherent in terms of an answer. And I start, I think, with politics. And the questions that, even though what's always striking to me, and this is, I think, the kind of built-in feature of the term and the way we also think about it, even though I try to emphasize of, emptiness is not actually absolutely empty, it's not to be taken literally, we cannot actually move away from the binary perception of emptiness as empty and being the opposite of the full, which is not anyone's shortcoming. It is kind of the part of the symbolic repertoire within which emptiness as a term in our kind of experience of modernity sits. But what is striking here is that when we line up the things that everyone brought up as subjects or examples of non-empty, or who says that something is not empty or may not be not empty. We had the middle class that was erasing the ruins of socialism in nature parks. We had something that we might vaguely refer to as multi-species, though who's the subject here we don't know yet, so let's go back to that. We had nature, indeed, in this kind of multi-species setup. I've had examples in Latvia given to where, again, the elites, the kind of national neoliberal elites would say it's a matter of perspective. Look, there's one successful entrepreneur, nothing is empty, it's full, it's just the subproletariat who calls it empty. So every instance of someone asserting non-emptiness is a political moment in which a particular subject emerges, and it is not actually always clear who that subject is and towards what substantive political ends is that subject working. So for example, when we go to your field sites and you speak about this green growth thing, what's the formulation? Green growth strategy? No, green, is that right?
European Green Deal.
Green Deal, yeah, but there was something else you said, green growth strategy. So it's interesting that there, the implied subject for that strategy is not named. Is it the sort of new universal subject of planetary significance? Who is it? We don't really know. And you said, in this particular instance, there was a particular corporation, that took advantage of this. Whereas, the kind of maybe the subject of socialist or other type of projects of justice emancipation might be, justice or emancipation might be some kind of political ends, right? So there's an implied end or implied subject that is not always articulated. And I think that every instance of sort of claiming whether something is empty or not involves this implied subject, implied political ends that we don't see. And every bit of that is a political moment. And that said, actually, when I really kind of, it might seem sort of, I don't know, parochial that I keep going back to sort of significance of ethnography, but for me it's actually not. When I talk to people who use this term, it's what it really actually comes closest to is precisely this non-binary space. That for them, emptiness is this in-between space between an old order that's ending and a new one that cannot yet be seen. So this act of claiming non-emptiness or something like that is actually an act of giving form to something that seems to have lost form. And it's, so this is what I'm trying to also write about, think about it in this emptiness itself being this non-binary space. Because if you really think about it in these binary terms, there's no shared space within which all of us could sort of see it, from some kind of meta, bird's eye view and see all possibilities. It forces us to choose. So it's an interesting political question about when can we dwell in this in-between space that hasn't yet taken form, where political subjects haven't emerged yet, where imaginaries of future haven't been clearly articulated yet, and where do we fight over, is this empty or full? And our struggle over this question, is this empty or full, is a political struggle. And I think that's extremely important to acknowledge. And socialism, I basically agree with everything you said about this sort of, and also have written about the zombie socialism, you know, and this sort of, the way that it emerges as this sort of thing to be done away with. And again, it's very much political, particular political subject, you know, who actually do this. And for me, actually, I think politically speaking, emptiness is potentially that space where, okay, we don't yet know, you know, we don't know yet what the ideology of the future would be and what politicals and who will speak for whom. And I guess it's a genuine question for me. For example, I don't know who speaks for the multi-species. I just can't get my head around it. And, you know, it's not the ethnographer. How do we kind of, you know, and you probably know, Pavanelli has written about forces, voices, these kind of encounters that have an effect on you, but you can't really speak for it, and you can be some kind of affected and somewhat agentful actor in that constellation, but you can't speak for it. So who then takes on the role, you know, and which bureaucrats are depoliticizing the space that seemingly was being repoliticized, you know, after this sort of Cold War liberalism. I have a lot more to say to the smaller individual questions, but maybe I should stop here as a kind of an attempt to draw it together a bit and see who wants to add.
Thank you, Dot. So yeah, let's continue in this way. Let's give word to anyone who is irritated enough to respond or to continue, please.
Yeah, I also wanted to respond to this issue of binary thinking, how to think about the non-human, etc. Because I think, I mean, first of all, what Datsa just said, we think of emptiness mainly as a space of reconfiguration, so it's not a condition necessarily, or not only, but it's a reshuffling of relations between constitutive elements that very much include the non-human. So we don't exclude that dimension, but I think what we can say is that we still look at how humans make sense of those changes that they're experiencing and that they're seeing. But another thing that I wanted to draw our attention to is this thinking across scales, because as you rightly pointed out, emptiness looks very different depending on, in relation to what you look at it. So emptying of places might be very good in terms of combating climate change, in terms of the planetary dimension, but on the very micro level, if you've lived in a place that used to be thriving and then it's emptied, it's devastating. And it's also our aim to precisely take these scales into consideration and reflect on all of these levels. And another dimension that I recently thought about in terms of how to resolve this problem of human-centrism and the non-human is to also think in terms of a more historical dimension. Because, for example, my coal mining town wasn't always a thriving coal mining town. It's actually just been there for 100 years. So in a way, the prosperity that emptiness emerges in relation to is quite an artificial one, in the sense that it's linked to a non-human thing that was found underneath the ground and then was industrialized and precisely led to a reordering of the place. And now it's fading, it's depleted, and another cycle of reordering takes place. So I think it's good to add this historical dimension of saying how cycles of growth and decay and of blossoming and withering are very natural and occur all the time, even to the scale of the demise of civilizations. Yeah, I'll stop here and let Masha maybe start.
Yeah, I guess I would like to continue the line talking about who says a place is empty and the subject, and the state, of course. So I was, before going to do my research in Armenia, I was intending to do my research in Russia. And there's this also thinking about, well, the state is withdrawing, but who says it? Like, people say the state is withdrawing based on their experience that there is no services, there is no bus running anymore, there is no school there, but then there's a portrait of Putin in every local administration. So the state is there, but it's just like a different presence of the state. And the same goes to Armenia. There's no services, there's no bus, but then there's a monument to Karabakh and there's the flags of Armenia everywhere, and the portraits of the heroes and the victims of the war, which is also pretty much about the state, and the state is there, but it's just not taking care of the people. So, and in their perspective, there is no state, even though from the perspective of me, who comes there, I actually see the state. So, and they never talk about emptiness, also like talking about the terms, right? So, emptiness for us is like an overarching term, how we try to make sense of how people talk. But in my field side, people talk about abandonment, or they talk about darkness. Then in other places, it could be also some other terms that people employ. So they not necessarily talk about the state. About emptiness. It's just like a term that we are using to make sense, I guess, of all of these changes. But it is an emic term pretty much, and then we try to make sense of how these emic terms, they line up together or don't line up together, and collecting them also in a way, and mapping the different reality people try to portray with these terms.
Just quickly, I just wanted to note that actually this point about push and pull is very important. We have I think I've earlier thought about it as a kind of places where capital concentrates, it sort of waits on the edge, while this place will crumble to come in. And we have the colleague at Oxford, Mayanka Mukherjee, who wrote a thesis on London, on empty spaces in London, which is exactly what you're talking about. So yeah, indeed, it's essential.
Thank you. I would just add to this that, of course, we do not dwell on some sort of binaries, but the question of fullness, what is opposite to emptiness, is in fact indeed becoming crucial once we look at the question of agency or political possibility of politicization in the conditions of emptiness, because what is imagined as a full life or a reconstitution of sociality and some kind of social order, which is imagined as normal, imagined good life or promised good life, these are all. There is, of course, the possibility of the very possibility of something opposite to emptiness cannot be defined, because it's defined actually by people who live there. So this is in a way an emic concept, but it's an emic concept that is in relation to many other things that emerge there, and that's why we studied. We think it's important to have it as an index of a certain bundle of relations in a certain place that are very important to trace, because it's dynamics. There is something happening. Although people say it's empty, but it's actually something either crumbled or something is emerging. So I think we are not, of course, dwelling on some kind of rigid. Thank you.
I just want to say what is the opposite in Moldova. It's not fullness to emptiness or to hold. I wanted to say it's bridge. And it's bridge because bridge connects. First of all, it allows you not to be in a pit, but it connects the west and the east, which Moldovans think that they are in between, and that places them also in the pit. So. Bridge. Thank you.
Just a brief response to the bridge. I do think in kind of rare or not so rare cases, the bridge also remains without another side. So I think when we think of the opposite of emptiness, sometimes even that is not clear. So it might be a memory of a past, but then a past that you don't necessarily want back, or a very fuzzy vision of the future that you can't quite articulate. Or, you see where I'm going. So I think in these cases where the opposite can be very clearly articulated, emptiness also becomes a kind of order in itself, perhaps, that where it is clear that it will remain this transitional space for a long time to come. Because someone was bringing up the almost automatic impulse that spaces of emptiness always create these ideas, or generate these ideas for transformation. I do think it's important to not automatically jump into this logic, okay, as soon as something is or feels empty, there needs to be something that happens with it in terms of a hope amidst ruins kind of rhetoric, but it can also remain in the state of limbo.
I'm sorry.
Another thing I wanted to say is maybe we should learn, as anthropologists, we should learn from geographers to work more closely with scales. First of all, if emptiness is a sort of reordering of things in a certain place, what triggered this reordering was often not there. It was somewhere national, international, right? The fall of socialism and all this was not necessarily a local thing, was pretty much at least an European, if not a global process. So to think with scales, just give you a short example, this small town we work, Tutakan, they used to produce very good boats. They have a long tradition. They are fishermen. They were fishermen. They're still fishermen, and they produced very good boats for global market. Now during socialism, now they don't do that, and very often I felt that they really sorry they were disconnected from the global market. So. If we think in terms of scale, sometimes disconnection from global market could be seen as something very bad, something which produce a lot of economic damage for these local people. And I can give you more ethnographic examples about that, but scales and connections and disconnections, I think also could be something you can play with, and maybe it's helpful.
Just a small thing. It seems to me that nature fits so well into emptiness. You know, it's like it's a moral fix for emptiness. And I think it deserves to be dwelled more into this kind of affinity between nature and emptiness. Thank you.
I just remembered about talking about emptiness and as this binary emptiness and fullness. There's this article actually based on data from Romania, which is called Moral Vectors, Transitional Time, and an Utopian Object of Impossible Fullness. So, and it portrays this, it talks about the situation when people would talk about normality, portraying like the socialist time, it was normal, it was full, there was something, and then they refer to this like back in times. But then this is gone. Even though this normality, this fullness was never achieved, it was like going towards communism, never being achieved. So this is like this utopian perception of when everything was full, and then when it's gone, now how do you refer to it? And the opposite to this impossible fullness is emptiness, which is also, so at its fringes, the emptiness and fullness, they are not defined, but we always look at something in between and always in the making. So fullness, if you would talk about fullness, if this panel was about fullness, then there would be questions, what about emptiness? So, and now since we talk about emptiness, then the question is, what is fullness?
Would you come to a panel which is called fullness?
I don't know. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, about the scales. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think the way we work with scales is kind of laterally. I think we think of, or relationally rather, thinking of these localities as sort of certain kind of relationally produced conjunctures, and then thinking laterally from them. So not sort of from local to global to whatever, but relational sort of scales. But yeah, that's absolutely disconnection. Is definitely could be a good or a bad, again, depending on what one wants to do. Create a new community of old believers that is disconnected from the world, or become reconnected to something. Actually, at this point about nature, it is absolutely but it also comes from probably in some way our sort of modern legacies of thinking about man and nature, right? Because I'm thinking Zimmel and this essay on ruins, which is all about this kind of upward tendency of humans and the downward pull of the nature. And for him, it was this kind of perpetual struggle. And ruination happened when humans receded, and nature kind of won in this perpetual struggle. And we see sort of an inversion of this binary in some way. So it's how easy nature fits into this is suspicious, right? It sort of calls for really an interesting, but I think we certainly haven't focused on that interface as much as we could, for sure.
I want to come back to the Imi kind of like definition of emptiness, and I get that is very, very neat interpretation. At the same time, like, I wonder politically. For instance, with like race in admission in US colleges, like all these, like anthropologists pointing out, there is no race, there is no, and you get native populations saying, wait, let's keep the race, administration and system, because it helps us get into those, privileged spaces. The same with like, Elizabeth Dunn's work on nothing and nothingness, right? There is no absolute nothingness, but at the same time, I wonder, like in those refugee camps, if you get water or you don't get water, it makes a huge difference regardless of how people, define certain things. So I think I haven't developed a full theory yet, but I wonder about it, Like, I remember in grad school, like, we had 20 optionals to choose from, and we're saying like there are no classes to choose from. Although in retrospect, all of them seem great, So is this kind of like, not, Lenin's kind of like imposition of, there is emptiness or fullness. However, I think, like if there's water in a place, or like electricity, maybe the people's definition, need to be blended in with those things.
Sorry, can I just add just one point about this intimate connection between emptiness and nature? Maybe it's like that because we got accustomed to think about nature as a space of intervention, right? As emptiness seems sometimes, or very often, a space of intervention of the state, of the capital, of the people, and so on, of different kind of actors. And it is like that because we got to think of nature as producing, ecosystem services, right? Giving us natural resources to fix our economic growth problems, to find solace, to find salvation, to find awe, So maybe this intimate connection between emptiness and nature is because we created nature as a passive thing on which we act, from which we extract, which we commodify, and which we just engulf in our kind of productive processes, right?
Sorry, just a provocative point, a little bit how.
That's your briefing response.
Just quickly say, it's interesting because it just occurred to me this chain of practices through which, let's say, we, kind of a, broadly speaking, I don't know, middle class European subject, I don't know what the we is, but are increasingly invited or invite ourselves to live through various forms of repentance. And so this is one of them, but there are others. And so there's a kind of a, Almeida Ahmad, I think is her name, a German scholar, do you know her? That she has kind of reinvented German nationalism by thinking that it doesn't have a kind of a center of gravity, as Herder suggested, but its center is shame, essentially, and repentance for past crimes. So anyway, it's just, there's a family resemblance there that also I think is worth tracing.
Thank you. I think Kalin, no. Thank you. I think we owe something to our audience because they really stay with us for the whole time, and we are also would be super curious to hear what your major reflections are or questions to us. So here I would open the floor, and I would actually, I'm not sure how it works, but suggest passing the microphone if it's possible. That's the maximum. Okay, yeah, maybe try to come out if you want to ask, because we have limited space.
So we're privileged.
Yeah, well, you are. Try not to please. Yeah, you please introduce yourself and then ask.
I'm Gerd Duizings from Germany. I'm Dutch, by the way, but I teach in Germany. And I was thinking of the concept of chaos. You were referring to the entanglements of this concept of emptiness with concepts of chaos, and I'm kind of pointing now at a text by Joanna Kusiak. Perhaps you know her text, where she is actually very much problematizing this concept of chaos, saying that's a very lazy way of actually understanding the political economy that is surrounding issues of what in emic terms is called chaos, yeah, or in emic terms may be called emptiness. So I'm just perhaps pushing you or provoking you to ask, what is the critical content of what you're doing?
I think you over here will use this microphone, and this is probably because it's difficult to know.
Thank you very much. Where the chaos reference comes from is that speaking about, or even just really beginning to speak about emptiness, it's amazing what a generative term it has been, and it runs away from us every time. We try to talk about it, and we try to kind of hold it to what we're talking about, and it runs away. And I think it's actually, that's a good thing, to learn to kind of navigate this, running away. And chaos, this juxtaposition is often brought up, origin stories and so forth and so on. So not in this kind of economic sense, but about sort of the genealogy of the term and its imbrication with origin stories. I don't yet have, to that extent, so in my interlock, when I speak with the concrete people that are using this term, they have some of that repertoire, but it's not the only one that they draw on when they talk about this. So the working out of their kind of frameworks of meaning is clearly one thing that we're doing. I'm actually also just was thinking about Edward Cassie's work on the fate of place, which begins very much with reflections about trying to actually counter all this imagination that chaos is what came before, what chaos even is, that in fact it's this sort of a moment at which form is given to something, and this kind of political moment that I spoke about earlier, that there's nothing out of which something comes, but that moment is a moment of giving form. And I think it's I think there could be many critical trajectories, but the one that's kind of I'm focusing on at the moment is precisely this kind of, and again, that's I think what Livia was sort of pointing towards, is this lack of a privileged objective space within which you don't have to take a stance of some kind, you know, that sort of saying empty or full is in itself, you know, already a political act. And yet this also the value of actually pausing a little bit before jumping to some kind of ready-made solutions, you know, as you said, you have to fill something that is empty. But I'll get back to you in about 3 years from now. Thank you very much though for that, yeah.
I'll just take advantage of this privileged position. I'm Catalin Velasco, is my name. What you introduced gives me the opportunity to reflect on the opposite term of emptiness, which might be fullness, of course, but also it could be density, which was somehow introduced by Razvan, who mentioned the European Council overusing now, which is now a key term, which is functional urban areas, and you will hear it for many years to come. FUA, functional urban areas. It's a key concept in urban planning, which is kind of brutal and rudimentary term for work commuters, for commuters. So it's a commuter area. This is the only principles that they would apply to urban planning nowadays. So you have the strong concept of magnet cities. So development should only occur with winners of the competition. And then the territory is defined by this only this very rudimentary concept, I mean, really rudimentary, because I'm an urban planner, so I was hoping to find some refinement in it, and it's actually just this. It's just this. And it's promoted by all European institutions, not just the European Council, but many European projects and research is just trying to draw maps around the cities, which are drastically redefining the territories, as also Liviu mentioned, in how cities are, taking over the hinterland and redefining the hinterland. Then another opposite term might be speed, because I think empty spaces are slow spaces. I'm not very well convinced by this. Of course, you're at the sort of the beginning of your investigation, so you're trying to extend the meaning of emptiness to many, many things, and it's of course appealing and relatively easy to do it. But in a sense, when you describe emptiness in cities, this is just, it's a break. It's like a pause in a melody, or a break in between two discourses. Whereas when you have a geographical concept, it's like silence. So you have the speed and the noise of the city with its small breaks, which are sort of emptiness, but they're actually pauses. Versus this very, very large territories that I experienced since this spring. I don't know what happened, but I was an innocent researcher of emptiness, because I traveled in the south of Romania, in the north of Bulgaria, in Macedonia, and in Albania. And you drive for thousands of kilometers, and there's a car every 15 minutes, every 20 minutes. So I think that's a different sort of emptiness, which has a you can apply a real phenomenology to it, or a poetics of it, which is like silence, lack of density, slowness, and all that. So extending the meaning of emptiness leads to what you aptly introduced as Saskia Sassen's expulsion, which generates a systemic edge. So is this emptiness systemic, is my question. And if it is systemic, not only in economical terms, which generates pauses in an urban tissue, as we overuse this term in urban planning, but also as territories which are devoid of like anything. Okay, so that was too much, but I still have something. I was many years ago in Budapest having a tour of industrial abandoned sites, and we were a group of researchers, but one of the researchers was a guy who was an American banker, so he was the only one probably that was on the right. The rest of us were, on the left. Let's face it. And the guy said, we were looking at those abandoned industries, and you can imagine what we were discussing about. And he said, but listen guys, this is dead capital. And dead capital is the central concept of Hernando de Soto. So it's a thing that waits to be recuperated by the big capital. This is dead capital, and there's very much a live capital that is going to eat it and process it and turn it into whatever, something brilliant and digestible or something. So I think it's a strong concept. We don't like it. I don't like it personally, but it's a very strong concept by this dude that managed to change or to support many very liberal regimes in South America.
In the middle of this emptiness in these areas, there are these places owned by big mafia guys. The only places that are alive or nice. Yeah? In Bulgaria, you saw them on the seaside. If you go, these derelict villages, there is no people. The streets are crumbling, and then there is this new resort made by some Russian oligarch or some Russian businessman or some Bulgarian businessman. Yes.
I think, thank you for provocative questions and ways to think. But is actually, we've also been trying to, of course, position ourselves in relation to other ways of other concepts. But yeah, the metaphor of a song and speed, which is, I guess, quite traditional in architecture. I think for us, at least for me, because each of us has the right to interpret this notion and use this notion to its own extent, yeah. At least in my case, the song is something that actually you enjoy to some extent, that increases your flourishing, your conatus ascendi in a way. And the song can be jazz, or it can be, I don't know who likes electronic music, it can be something else. The thing is that emptiness in my case would be some sort of the defect in the recording that was not intended, or some instrument broke down, or the singers don't sing well, like this kind of thing that prevents it from enjoying this music. Of course, we can continue this metaphor and say that we can have a battle between various groups and so on, and this will be the metaphor of who defines what is empty. For Nato de Soto, yeah, that's an opportunity, and we've actually been reflecting on this. So for him, that's a song that is bad, that's needs to be tuned up and so on. Yeah, very nice, thank you. Maybe someone wants to react. You have your.
Yeah, talking about Fawaz, yeah, quite an old concept from, I think, 1910s, emerged in the US. So the city, the core of the city kind of overtakes this place, which is also presumably kind of empty of this urban life. And this brings to think about emptiness, which is desirable emptiness, and emptiness, which is unwanted emptiness. Sort of like this in colonial times, there was this frontier, and there was this emptiness that needs to be, that people desire. They want to have this land, they want to develop it, modernize and whatnot. And then there's this, what I think we are looking at is this emptiness that is demodernized, neglected. So in this sense, another binary can be care and neglect, in this sense where neglect is emptiness, is being emptied, and then care is this, the speed, the density, the fullness, the noise, and yeah, whatnot.
I think it's actually systemic. I think that's how I would think about it, that it's not a cause, that it is actually something. And I really like this kind of, your combination of, poetics and the scale at which you're thinking. I think it's, I actually first learned that emptiness smells when I came to Bucharest 4 years ago, and I suddenly was just overtaken by the scent of damp basement from the abandoned buildings. It hadn't occurred to me before, so I think it's the phenomenology and geography is very good together.
If I may also add something, thanks for bringing in the element of urban planning. Just wanted to say that, of course, we're not only looking within our emptying places, but also the positions, the spots that they used to occupy in past order, and how they're remobilized, perhaps, for a new kind of spatial configuration. And I'm just thinking, as you were talking about this emptying town in Eastern Germany, whose urban development strategy was to wait until the bigger city 50 kilometers away would grow enough so that people would spill into it. So they didn't even do anything, but they were just sort of relating their own emptiness to the growth of a nearby city. But I think there's more to be said about just magnetic cities, as you called them, and hinterlands. There's this concept of the horizontal metropolis that is currently sort of gaining traction, and I think that's mentioned this concept of Schmilka, but there are loads of other examples where, especially post-pandemic, emptying places, the countryside become repopulated by creative people, by escapists, by all kinds of urban people who are then sort of creeping into these empty spaces, but not transforming them as a whole, but just creating sort of islands of odd new lifestyles that remain very much urban. So you've got co-working spaces, yoga retreats, you've got these fancy cafes maybe emerging, but it doesn't really develop into something integrated. And at least in my field site, that's something I'm going to be following, especially how this sort of spatial melange will continue to unfold.
Thank you. Thank you. So I, as a moderator, I need to say that we are over time because we promised. But since I see that people are actually interested in that and the reactions are extremely stimulating and clever, I would ask whether you would be fine with staying a bit more over time. Yeah. If nobody is against, then I would give the floor to a couple of more questions. If our hosts are fine with that, because I think they're fine.
Okay, but you need to come out, unfortunately.
Hi, so first of all, thank you for kind of like all these challenging perspectives on emptiness. I'm working on my own kind of research over how art interacts with urban emptiness. And one of the things that keeps coming up, especially in Bucharest, is that emptiness in urban areas is related a lot to access. And here I'm thinking also about like maybe Casa Radio, Parcul Bucharest, where this kind of limiting of access is an inherent part of that space not being occupied or only being occupied through trespassing, you know, and that kind of limiting of access can also be made through legal, physical, or just, you know, lack of accessibility. And I was wondering how that works into other kinds of spaces and stuff like that.
Maybe take a, if there are others.
Yeah, okay, let's have a couple more because it's logistically would be easier to see logistics.
Or just comments or stories.
Yeah, I would invite
Have things to share.
Hello, my name is Nico. I'm from Republic of Moldova. I'm a student of sociology. So I was thinking of about the political aspect of emptiness. You were talking about the presence of the state. It actually exists, but somehow at the same time it's not present there. So I was thinking that somehow the emptiness suits the state, not only in economical point of view. And I want to give the example of Lukashenko in Belarus, where the Belarusian state media is making these videos of him, where he's going out of his house and parliament and presidential residency in some half-ruined industrial zones, in some half, I don't know, totally isolated post-industrial factories and something like this. And he comes there and is criticizing not the state that he represents, but this the heads of the industries, the bureaucracy, and somehow I thought that the emptiness somehow suits some regimes, semi-autocratic, semi-authoritaristics, because it's not their fault that there is an emptiness. And they start with the point of view that the emptiness is something a priori negative, and somehow it makes them, it suits them, and they somehow give to the people that look, the bureaucracy is that they destroyed our Soviet flourishing past and something like this. So I was thinking about this, and I want to ask you if you somehow see this point that it is, and you see an emptiness that suits not only economical the status quo, but also politically and somehow like this. Thank you.
I will take one more and then sorry, we'll get one more and then respond. That's it.
Hi, I'm Zainab. I'm a student here. I study anthropology. So I was thinking about emptiness. I live here in Bucharest, and I was thinking about the buildings that are built illegally here, and then they are not used because they don't have approval. Like, they're built, everything is okay, they have the structure, but then they are left there for like 15, 20 years, and it's not doing anything. There's also like, I think like Piazza Victoriei, where's like the old Catholic church, there was like, how's it called, the building? It's like a very, yeah, the high-rise building, and it's said to be demolished for like almost like 10 years, and it's still like there and it's not occupied. And then also I was thinking about like the other buildings, like the historical buildings that are living like, it's basically they're in like very crowded places, but then they also have like guards, like, yeah, and then they accumulate debt because I was like, I'm also an urban explorer, so I like to do like, government buildings. And near here is like, how's it called, like an old headquarters, or that's what that man said to me. of the National Library, and he told me that like the bills are still accumulating and like it's accumulating debt, but like no one pays it. So I couldn't hear like the first part of the conversation, so I was like thinking about all this. I don't know how to put it in one question, so thank you.
There's one more, maybe.
First of all, thank you very much for all the insights that you've shared tonight. I've taken so many notes. My name is Mirona Gaman. I am a PhD student in cultural studies here at the University of Bucharest, but my activity revolves in the field of cultural heritage. So, considering all the role that cultural heritage can have in processes of nation building and identity formation and all these senses of place and sense of belonging, I was curious whether in your research you have taken a look at cultural heritage as a vector for either catalyzing emptiness or for minimizing it, and if you have done it, how? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's respond because there's a bit too many.
Maybe about the buildings somewhere on that side.
Let's remind you. So the first one was about the boundaries and lack of access, lack of access. The second one was about political role of emptiness in politics, in propaganda. The third one was about
The buildings that are built.
The newly erected buildings, and the third one is about the heritage.
Oh, is it up to you to want because that will
I hope no one gets electrocuted. Sorry, Masha. I will just answer very briefly to the last question about cultural heritage. I have a PhD in cultural heritage, so that's very relevant for me. When you talk about land abandonment, cultural landscapes is a very, very important notion, and land abandonment just hinders the existence of cultural landscapes. So that's why you have to intervene upon this emptiness in order to safeguard these cultural landscapes with everything that they bring: traditional ecological knowledge, traditional livelihoods, protected denomination products of the European Union, and so on. So this plays a very, very important role in intervening into this emptiness that is considered a negative place, because there is the opposite, which is a cultural landscape which is very rich. It involves not only values of nature, but also cultural values, social values, and so on.
About the cultural heritage, I mean, it's yes and no. Obviously, it's one in my primary fieldwork sites. The material remains are of Soviet socialism of the 1970s, and as put by one art student in a recent conversation I had, is those are prefab buildings anyway. They should just collapse. I mean, what heritage of socialism is not, it's devalued, you know, it goes back to your point, it's just not there, you know, so you could sort of find ruins of pre-Soviet farmhouses that you might use to that effect, but not the actual recent past. I love it, seems to
I actually wanted to answer, give an example slash answer to the question about political and emptiness and political. So emptiness is being largely politicized. So Dati, for example, did an article, I remember, like Latvian borderlands, especially at this like strategical zones like borderlands, or in Russia it's also like in the borderland, but also in the Arctic. So there's a lot of talk how the state constructs this external other through looking at emptiness. Like, look, these places are empty, this is a threat. There's China, look, China is going to overtake Russia if Siberia is going to be empty, even though research shows that there are more immigrants from Russia to China than vice versa. And so the same, I remember the same discourse was in Datson's article about that Russians are going to overtake Latvia if the borderland is going to be empty. And then the same goes to kind of to the Arctic. So what are we going to do if the Arctic is not going to be populated, then how are we going to extract resources? So the Arctic has to be populated. And there are numerous big programs that try to repopulate these empty spaces. For example, in Russia there's this project called Far Eastern Hectare, so people can get a hectare of land in the Far East. And the funny thing is that who is going to go for a hectare of agricultural land to the Far East when the conditions are like agriculturally terrible? So this is a solution for something for the beginning of the 20th century, but for now, like, people would go for a job or, I don't know, like some other reasons. So emptiness is largely being mobilized in various ways in political discourses. And in Germany, like maybe Friederike can also comment on that, these empty places are being feared because they are the places of the far-right movement, and people, like, they do vote for the far-right in this for various reasons. So it's being, it is on the political agenda, and it is being feared. So yeah, there's a lot of, I don't know if Volodya wants to comment about Lukashenko.
I will, but you can.
And I'll just briefly expand on the last point. Yeah, I think emptiness also serves really well as space for recolonization. And in Germany, that's a really pronounced discourse in 2.5 ways. So one, Masha just mentioned, these left behind places, uncoupled places, spaces of emptiness have become a sort of feared internal other space where new right movements grab land essentially and settle there under the radar of the state and sort of normal civil society. They settle there to live on subsistence agriculture, sort of this, we call it a brown ecology, so sort of reconnecting with the land, but with a very particular ideological twist. And it's something that the local mayors, for example, in the place in questions where these groups settle are quite ambivalent about, because they, on the one hand, welcome that these places are repopulated. There's this big, right-wing intellectual center with a publishing company and a training center emerging in a small town. That's actually went there, and we went there together. And they bring basically value, tourism, purchasing power back into these places. So it's, in terms of that discourse, it's good, but in terms of ideology, it's feared. And there are discourses of colonization against left-wing sort of entrepreneurial projects that then residents who find themselves or see themselves as indigenous to these emptying spaces, they feel colonized by the horizontal metropolis. And then, of course, you've got the corporate, economic kind of discourse where, especially in the context of the energy transition, empty places are used for wind parks and solar parks, which again, the remaining residents are strongly opposed to. That's it.
Okay, then I will pick up two questions. One was about the boundaries and access. I tried to, when my fieldwork was so possible in Ukraine, I tried to write something about fences, the rise of fashion and fences in villages and towns, which I did never notice before when I lived in Ukraine. And yeah, it was really kind of very obvious thing that people can create borders to fight off various dangers or to limit their territory and so on. But obviously what these borders do, except for protecting and signifying, is they delimit, of course, the private ordered full whatever territory from the public space, which is neglected, which nobody is responsible for, and I noticed that in many households you see proper asphalted entrance and then completely destroyed roads. So that's, of course, borders don't only prevent fullness from entering empty spaces, but also they create it as spaces of nobody's interest, neglect. Yeah, and the second question is Lukashenko. That was I wrote a lot about Belarus. That's of course, I think it's a common it's locus communis for Soviet-type populist, authoritarian populist discourse is of course pointing at someone who makes our life difficult. This will be the spaces of disorder, bardak, the spaces of neglect, and some kind of vile intent. So, of course, Lukashenko would appear and point at these spaces, at these areas that are disorderly, that are that subvert the good flow of functioning of the state. So, of course, he comes to these areas because these areas are someone made them so. So these are purposefully made things, of course. And what reminds that's something that this question reminded me is the synonym, in fact, the synonym of emptiness, spaciousness, or how to say, prostorness, spaciousness, is of course the extremely positively connoted term that in Belarus is used, because spaciousness is a property of order and emptiness is a property of disorder. So it's, okay, thank you. Let's say we have 10 more questions. Oh, sorry, minutes. So that's like two, 3 questions.
Can I just quickly add on top of that? Is that I want actually to go back to this critical space and thinking that maybe we can do a more formal continuation. But with the war, I have to say that at least in Latvia, what I can see in Eastern Europe and Europe more generally, the critical space is narrowing very significantly. And even before raising these questions in Latvia, that firmly set its eyes towards integration in the European Union and NATO and thought of it as an absolute geopolitical necessity at all costs, which is why we've seen such severe austerity politics in Latvia and elsewhere. What actually you can't really publicly, legitimately speak about emptiness in this way without being thought of as playing into the hands of Russian propaganda against the border, because and the Russian and some of the pre-war newspapers, when they wrote about these things, although they now write about it, still is to say, look across the border in the European Union, look at these emptying villages, you know, and so here I am saying, look at these emptying villages. And so it's, for me, it's also very important to maintain that to critical space, to not give into this, you know, narrowing that is basically kind of pulling the rug from whatever there was left of critique, you know, in this sort of neoliberal 30 years that we've had. And now this is really, I'm very concerned about that. So in a sense, I would really like to kind of work on keeping this critical space open and use emptiness as one of the ways to do it.
I just wanted to add to this thing with Lukashenko another interpretation. It can also mean that he was actually trying to downshifting management from the state to these big guys, businessmen or bureaucrats to manage well that, I mean, to upkeep the space. Because this is what this kind of neo-patrimonial regimes are doing. Like Putin is giving orders to big businessmen to build a bridge, upkeep that area of Russia. This is what Voronin was doing in Moldova as well, appealing to big businessmen from Moldova, to upkeep the monasteries, to keep them. So all these things are not actually political play in a way. They can be also managerial play. They are just saying to people in the new kind of order, neo-patrimonial order, what to do.
Yeah, all right. These images of Lukashenko on the background of something was during his regular trips around the country to tell people. Yeah, let's continue. Let's have a couple more questions.
If there are.
Yeah, if there are, of course. If everyone just stands up and goes, then. Okay, I see that everyone is tired. I hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll yeah, we definitely will leave this place in a very emotionally disturbed way, and it was very, full of new insights. But we invite you to follow us on our. I think. On the Facebook of London Home under our event, you will have a link at our website emptiness.eu, where you can read like more popular blog type of interventions from various people.
And please contribute.
Yes, and please contribute.
Part of building this archive.
Okay, thank you again, and thank you for our Romanian guests, and thank you for
hosts, really.
hosts, and definitely for the hosts. Thank you for the audience and great questions.
And thank you to Volodya.
Have a nice evening.
Cu forță. Nu. Trage de... Nu. Sigur. Trage pur și simplu de el. Așa.